Have you ever wondered what forbidden secrets the Vatican hides in the shadows of its underground libraries? What exists behind the locked doors, protected by centuries of silence? I'm Father Thomas Berry, and what I'm going to reveal now could forever change the way you see the Church. Last time I was here, I told you about a frightening event, the return of a demonic entity in another person. I thought my spiritual battle was over, but I was wrong. When I tried to look for answers, I was led to something much bigger, something that the Church itself tries to hide from all of us. It all started with a forgotten document buried among old files, a piece of paper yellowed with age, with writing in Latin and ecclesiastical seals that should never be touched. But there, right before my eyes, was the key to a mystery that no priest should dare question. Why are there exorcisms that have never been officially recorded? Why are there reports of demonic manifestations that simply disappeared from church archives? And most frighteningly, why did priests who tried to expose these truths simply disappear without a trace? I didn't know it, but by turning that page, I was crossing a dangerous line. What I discovered was not just a forgotten story, but a living threat. Something that could still be happening, hidden from the world. Something that, if revealed, could shake the faith of millions. But what happens when a priest discovers forbidden Vatican secrets? What happens when he gets too close to truths that shouldn't be known? I don't have all the answers yet, but I'm closer than ever, and that's what scares me. If what I found is real, then we are looking at something much bigger than anyone could imagine. The archives I discovered tell of priests who faced forces that defy all human understanding. Men of faith who were silenced when they tried to expose the truth. What did they know? What does the Vatican hide so deeply that not even we priests have access? The Church's silence on these cases is not simple forgetfulness. It is an intentional erasure. But why? Was it to protect the faithful from something they couldn't understand? Or to hide something that should never come to light? I need to know where this goes. But before I continue, I want to know what you think about it. Do you believe that the Church really hides forbidden secrets? What do you think could be locked away in the Vatican's secret archives? Leave your comment below, because your opinion can help me understand how far we should go in this investigation. And I guarantee what comes next is even more disturbing. I should never have found that place. It all started with a rumor, a whispered conversation between older priests who, upon seeing me approach, quickly changed the subject. But I had seen this before. When a secret is too big, silence becomes the only safe response. What made me insist was a phrase said by one of the priests in an unguarded moment. Some truths were not meant to be read. That stayed in my mind like an echo, and it was enough for me to begin my search. The Vatican is a labyrinth of corridors, locked doors and libraries, inaccessible to the public. There are places within the Church where not even a priest can enter without permission. I knew that, but I also knew that there was a path, a restricted access that few knew about. The problem is, the closer I got, the stronger the feeling that someone or something didn't want me to continue. It was on a silent night, while walking through the halls of an old church building, that I noticed a strange detail. A book on the library shelf seemed out of place. As I pulled it, I felt a slight shift in the wall next to me. My heart raced. Without thinking twice, I pushed the panel and came across a narrow passage, a dark, stuffy corridor, full of dust and an ancient smell of aged parchment. I continued forward, each step echoing in the absolute silence. At the end of the corridor, I found a heavy wooden door studded with symbols I had never seen before. It wasn't Latin, it wasn't Greek. It was something older, something that seemed to belong to knowledge that the Church itself had tried to bury. I took a deep breath and pushed the door. What I saw on the other side changed everything. The room was small but full of shelves crammed with documents, scrolls of parchment, leather-bound books, handwritten records in careful calligraphy. The air carried an almost physical weight, as if those pages were more than simple reports. I picked up one of the documents at random and started reading. What I found there made my skin crawl. They were reports from priests who had undergone supernatural experiences never disclosed to the public. Exorcisms that broke any standard, possessions that did not respond to the traditional rites of the church. Some priests spoke of voices whispering in their minds. Others described symbols appearing mysteriously on their skin. But most disturbing were the reports about priests who, after delving too deeply into these mysteries, simply disappeared. No traces, no explanations. I leafed through some more papers and found something even more alarming. A list of names. Men who, over the centuries, tried to reveal secrets that the church kept hidden. They all suffered the same fate, silencing. Their stories were erased, their deeds forgotten, their discoveries buried. The Vatican didn't just hide secrets, it erased those who dared discover them. But what was so dangerous that it justified this level of secrecy? I kept reading and noticed a pattern. Many of these priests reported the same thing. Forbidden knowledge, something that should never be accessed by human hands. A truth so great that it could shake the foundations of the faith of millions. And now, here I was, holding these documents in my hands, feeling the weight of something that could change everything. It was at that moment that I realized I was no longer alone. A biting chill ran down my spine, and a shadow moved at the entrance to the hallway. Someone knew I was there. Someone knew I had found the secret files. My fingers shook as I flipped through those pages. They were detailed accounts of exorcisms that had never been made public, documents written by priests who faced something far beyond what anyone could imagine. The handwriting varied. Some texts were firm and meticulous, others seemed shaky, written by hands that clearly belonged to men terrified by what they had seen. The first document I picked up was dated centuries ago, but what scared me most was realizing that many of these records were recent. The evil they described was not stuck in the past, it was still here, operating in the shadows. The first report spoke of a priest named Matteo, who answered an urgent call in a small, isolated village in Italy. The family of a 17-year-old boy claimed that the boy began exhibiting strange behavior after finding a book, buried in the basement of an old church. The exorcism began like any other, with traditional prayers and rites, but it soon got out of control. The young man spoke in unknown languages, and his body levitated about a foot above the ground, something that had never been officially documented by the church. Father Matteo himself described in his report that, in an unguarded moment, the possessed man laughed and mentioned obscure details of the priest's childhood, secrets that no one could know. What disturbed him most, however, was the moment when the young man's voice changed, becoming multiple, as if several entities were speaking at the same time. After this exorcism, Father Matteo disappeared without a trace, and the young man's family was sent to an unknown location where they were never seen again. I continued reading and found another case, this time in Latin America. A priest reported having been called to help a woman who, according to witnesses, had already undergone 3 unsuccessful exorcisms. What caught my attention was that, unlike the other cases, this woman seemed fully aware of her condition. She looked at the priest with a calm smile and, instead of resisting, said that she did not want to be released. During the ritual, as the holy water touched his skin, symbols appeared that no one could explain. They were marks that resembled ancient inscriptions, something that not even church scholars were able to decipher. But the worst happened on the 3rd day. Of trying, she began talking about events that had not yet happened, describing in detail tragedies that would occur weeks later. When they finally managed to expel whatever was inside her, the woman's body collapsed. She died right there in front of everyone, and the priest who performed the exorcism renounced his cassock days later, claiming that he had not fought against a simple demon, but against something much more ancient and powerful. These reports were just the beginning. The further I got into the documents, the more I understood that there was a pattern. Many exorcisms described there talked about entities that did not respond to the traditional methods of the church. Some priests reported that the possessions seemed more complex, as if they were not just spiritual, but part of something bigger, something planned. Those exorcised spoke of a marked time, mentioned dates and prophecies that made no sense to those who listened, but which for those who delved deeper into the study of secret archives had a disturbing meaning. One page caught my attention. It was a report signed by a bishop, someone high-ranking within the church, describing an exorcism carried out in an isolated monastery. The possessed was a monk who, according to the document, had never shown signs of any evil influence before that event. But one night during prayers, he began to struggle violently and scream in a language no one recognized. The most frightening thing was that, as he spoke, the stained glass windows in the chapel began to crack one by one, as if something invisible was exerting an immense force on the room. During the exorcism, the monk revealed detailed information about the Vatican itself, mentioning places within the Holy City that were unknown even to the priests present. No one could explain how he could know about these places, but the only possible explanation was that something inside him spoke through him. The document ended abruptly, without saying whether the exorcism was successful or not. But the strangest thing was what I found at the bottom of the page, a handwritten warning, unsigned, as if someone had tried to add a final warning. He just said, "Not everyone can be freed. Some are chosen to guard what must not be discovered." My breathing became heavy. What did this mean? What did these exorcisms have in common? What was being guarded and by whom? And most importantly, why has no one ever heard of these cases? I was faced with something the church never wanted revealed, something that was perhaps too dangerous to understand, but I had come too far to stop now. My eyes darted across the yellowed pages of those forbidden documents, taking in every dark detail, every terrifying account. But there was something that was repeated among the records, a name that appeared at the most critical moments in the stories, almost like a whisper, like a buried secret that should never be brought to light. At first I thought it was a coincidence, perhaps a transcription error, but as I leafed through more and more files, I realized that this name was present in the most disturbing cases, the most violent exorcisms, and the possessions that eluded any explanation. He always appeared in the context of something that should not be investigated. The name was Father Alfonso Grimaldi, but something was wrong. There was no official mention of him in the public records of the church, no citations in lists of priests, no trace of his existence in the Vatican's conventional archives. The only place his name appeared was in these secret reports, almost like a shadow that hovered over the most inexplicable events. And the more I looked, the more I noticed a pattern. Whenever a priest approached forbidden knowledge, this name appeared. And then silence. I began searching for information outside of the archives I had found, trying to track down any mention of him in less restricted documents. But each attempt resulted in frustration. It was as if the church had erased all evidence of its existence. What could a priest have done to be eradicated from history like this? What did he discover? And more importantly, what did they do with him? The most disturbing thing was realizing that, in some handwritten notes in the reports, his name was always accompanied by a strange symbol. 3 circles interconnected by a cross, a rudimentary design that appeared in the margins of several pages, like a hidden signature. Something inside me said that that symbol meant more than it seemed, and I needed to find out. It was then that I decided to ask other priests directly. But the reaction was immediate. Whenever he mentioned his name, he was met with tense faces, averted gazes, silences that spoke more than any response. Some simply refused to answer, pretending they hadn't heard. Others gave me vague answers, as if they wanted to distract me from the subject. But one, an older priest, one of the few who seemed to have lived long enough to know stories no one dared tell, held my arm tightly and said almost in a whisper, Never mention that name again, for your own sake. That sentence hit me like a punch in the stomach. What did it mean? Who was Alfonso Grimaldi? What did he know? Why did the church refuse to even talk about him? And why did I feel at that moment that I was approaching something that should never have been discovered? I couldn't get that name out of my head. Father Alfonso Grimaldi. Who was he? What did you discover? And more importantly, why didn't anyone dare talk about him? The more I tried to find answers, the more doors closed. Priests who used to talk to me about any topic now avoided my presence. Some simply looked away, others changed the subject in a hurry, as if my name was being whispered down corridors I shouldn't walk down. Silence was the loudest response I could receive, but I wasn't willing to stop. It was then that I remembered someone who might be able to help me. A man who, years ago, was inside the Vatican, close to the backstage of the church. A former high-ranking member who, for reasons never fully explained, abandoned his position and has lived in seclusion ever since. Many said he knew too much, that he had stepped aside to protect his own life. If anyone could tell me anything about Alfonso Grimaldi, it was him. It took me weeks to get in touch. My first email went unanswered. The second one too. It was only when I sent a message mentioning that name that I received a short and direct response. We met in person. Don't trust emails. Don't trust anyone. On the day of the meeting, I went to a small town in the countryside where he lived under a different identity. The cafe we booked in was discreet, almost empty, and he was already there when I arrived. The man looked tired, aged by the weight of years and the secrets he carried. As soon as I sat down, he stared at me for a few moments before saying something that made me shudder. If you've made it this far, then you've gone too far. I took a deep breath and mentioned the name, Alfonso Grimaldi. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if he was reliving something he would rather forget. Then he looked around, making sure no one was listening, and said in a low voice, "That name should have been forgotten, but you're not going to stop, are you?" I shook my head, and he sighed, as if he already knew my answer before I even asked. What he told me next made every hair on my body stand on end. Alfonso Grimaldi was not just a priest. He was an investigator, a man appointed to study phenomena that the church never wanted to make public. His mission was to document cases of possessions that were beyond the control of ordinary exorcists, understand patterns and, if necessary, find ways to contain something that not even faith could stop. But at some point, he discovered something he shouldn't have, something so big that the only way to silence it was to erase it from history. He found something in the secret Vatican archives, the former member continued, his voice lower than before. Something that the church has hidden for centuries. Something that could change everything we know about evil, about faith, about the Vatican's own role in the world. I pressed him to tell me more, but he hesitated. He looked at the door, at the windows, as if expecting someone to appear at any moment to stop us from continuing that conversation. He didn't want to say it, but he finally blurted out some words that seemed to weigh tons. Alfonso discovered that some possessions were not what they appeared to be, that not all exorcisms were about casting out a demon. Some were about trapping something inside a human body, something that should never be released. My mind was spinning. To secure. What did this mean? I always learned that exorcism was an act of liberation, a battle to rescue a soul from the control of evil. But if there was hidden knowledge about rituals that did, the opposite, who or what was being restrained? The man in front of me didn't want to talk anymore. His breathing was labored, his eyes moved quickly, as if something inside him was fighting the idea of telling me more. But he left me one last warning. Stop now before they realize what you're doing, before they do to you what they did to him. The conversation ended there. He got up, put some coins on the table and left without looking back. I stood there, trying to process everything I had. Just heard. If what he said was true, then my investigation wasn't just dangerous. It was something that could lead me to a fate worse than death. And at that moment I realized I had no choice. I needed to continue. And if you've made it this far, I know this story has grabbed you. I know you felt the weight of this mystery. So now, I need you to do something for me. You already know what it is. Press the button, like now, because this is not just a story, this is a discovery that needs to be shared. If you think this mystery needs to be revealed, if you believe the truth cannot be hidden, then give the like right now. This helps more than you might think. Are you with me on this? So let's continue. I knew that after that encounter I could no longer ignore what was happening. The former Vatican member gave me a glimpse of something much bigger than any single exorcism, something that wasn't just about cases of demonic possession, but about a hidden purpose, a silent plan that had been unfolding for centuries without anyone knowing. What did the idea that not all possessions were expulsions mean, and that some were used to contain something inside a human body? The more I thought about it, the more I felt the answer lay in the secret files I had found. But I needed more. I needed proof. I returned to the hidden place where I had found the never-published accounts of exorcisms. I knew that among those dusty shelves, among old documents and pages yellowed with age, there was something that would give me the missing piece. I went straight to the boxes that looked the least organized, the ones that looked like they had been left there in a hurry, as if someone had tried to hide them but didn't have time to do it right. It was then that I found an envelope that was different from the others. It was thicker, sealed with a wax seal that had already been broken, as if someone had read that document before me. But unlike the other files, which were handwritten accounts by priests and exorcists, this document seemed official. It was an internal church memo, with seals indicating that it should not be read outside the Vatican's inner circle. The title gave me goosebumps from head to toe. Spiritual Confinement Protocols. My heart accelerated. Lockdown. Not exorcism, not liberation, but confinement. It was the first time I had seen this term associated with possessions. I tore off the seal and started reading. The document spoke of cases in which the church had decided not to expel evil entities, but rather arrest them within certain individuals using methods unknown to the common clergy. These possessions were not seen as an attack, but rather as a strategy, something that should be kept under control. And the most shocking thing was that these were no ordinary demons. The text mentioned a term that I had never seen before in any religious book: ancestral presences. They were not human spirits. They were not fallen angels. They were something different, something older than the Christian faith itself. The document suggested that throughout history, some of these entities had been sealed inside human bodies, preventing them from returning to their full state. And for this to remain working, certain rituals had to be performed regularly. Some possessions, instead of being fought, were simply administered. The shock of this revelation made me realize something disturbing. All the accounts I had read before, all the stories of failed exorcisms, missing priests, strange symbols appearing on victims, it could all be connected. What happened if one of these lockdowns failed? If one of these bodies could no longer support the presence it carried? And worse, who decided that a person should carry this burden? I kept reading and found something even more terrifying. The document mentioned names, not only from victims of these administered possessions, but also from priests responsible for keeping them under control. It was a list of priests over the centuries who had been tasked with ensuring that these presences remained imprisoned. My blood ran cold when I realized that one of the names on the list was exactly the one no one dared to mention: Father Alfonso Grimaldi. Now everything made sense. He wasn't just a priest who studied exorcisms. He was part of something much bigger, something the church hid, not because it was dangerous to the faith, but because it could completely change the way we understand the battle between good and evil. The question I feared most began to form in my mind. What if the goal of the church is not just to fight evil, but to use it for some purpose that no one can know? I knew I was messing with something dangerous, but I didn't expect the consequences to come so quickly. After finding that document and confirming that Father Alfonso Grimaldi was part of something much bigger than just exorcisms, I started to feel like I was no longer alone. At first, I thought it was paranoia. Little details that anyone could ignore, like the feeling of being watched or the impression that someone had gone through my things. But then, the more obvious signs began. One night, as I was leaving the parish, I saw a black car parked on the other side of the street. It wouldn't be suspicious at all if it weren't for the fantasy that he had seen him before. In the last few days, this same car appeared in different places, always close to where I was. I tried to ignore it, to tell myself it was a coincidence, but the discomfort persisted. The next day, when I returned to my room, I smelled a strange smell, a mixture of burning paper and incense. I approached the desk and saw that some of the documents I had brought were out of place. Someone was there. Someone knew what I was doing. The real blow came that morning. I woke up to a noise coming from the window, a low sound as if something had been slid under the wood. I stood up slowly, feeling a shiver run down my spine. There was a simple envelope with no return address lying on the floor of my room. My heart was pounding as I picked it up and opened it with shaking hands. Inside, just a small piece of paper with a single handwritten sentence. "Stop now. Some truths are not meant to be discovered." I felt butterflies in my stomach. There was no signature, there was no clue as to who could have sent it, but the message was clear. Someone was watching me. Someone knew exactly how far I had come and was warning me to give up before it was too late. Who could have left this message? Someone from the church itself, or someone who, like me, knew the forbidden secrets and tried to keep them from coming to light. From that moment on, everything changed. I began to notice that my presence was bothering some members of the church. Priests who had previously treated me cordially now avoided making eye contact with me. My conversation seemed to come to an abrupt halt as I approached, as if I had been marked, as if they already knew I had found something I shouldn't have. But the worst happened a few days later. As I left the parish at night, I felt a weight in my chest, that inexplicable feeling that something was wrong. It was then that I heard footsteps behind me, fast, precise, as if someone was deliberately following my movements. My body reacted before my mind, instinctively quickening my pace, but the steps also increased their pace. I didn't need to look back to know it wasn't my imagination. Someone was actually following me. My heart was racing, and my mind struggled to find a rational explanation. But deep down, I already knew there were no coincidences. After the anonymous letter, the car that seemed to follow me, and the documents turned over, those steps behind me were confirmation that I had crossed a limit that I should never have crossed. My discoveries weren't just stories buried in the church's secret archives. They weren't just legends erased by time. They were dangerous truths. And now, I was a target. The street was almost deserted, lit only by spaced streetlights and dim lights that cast distorted shadows on the ground. With every step I sped up, the steps behind me did the same. It wasn't my imagination. Someone was there. I tried to stay calm, take deep breaths, but my body had already gone on alert. I turned the corner suddenly and, on impulse, hid in the entrance of an old building. The silence was immediate. For a brief moment, the only thing I could hear was the sound of my own blood pumping in my ears. Then, the footsteps stopped. I waited for what seemed like an infinite amount of time, feeling the sweat running down the back of my neck. Finally, I worked up the courage to peek discreetly over the edge of the wall. The street was empty, no movement, no sound, but the feeling of being watched was still there, clinging to me like an invisible presence that I couldn't shake. That wasn't a warning, it was a threat. That night, I tried to sleep, but sleep didn't come. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind spinning non-stop. Everything I believed, everything I had learned within the church, seemed to be fragmenting before my eyes. I had become a priest because I believed in light, in truth, in the mission of bringing hope to those who needed it. But now, for the first time, I wondered if I really knew the institution to which I had dedicated my life. If the church hid such deep secrets, if there were priests tasked not with expelling evil but with imprisoning it, then what role did I really play in all of this? My faith was being tested like never before. Should I continue? Should I just pretend none of this happened and move on with my life? But then I remembered the name that no one dared to mention, Father Alfonso Grimaldi. I remembered the former Vatican member, the fear in his eyes when he talked about exorcisms that weren't exorcisms. I remembered the forbidden document, the ancestral presences, the people who disappeared after getting too close to the truth. And then I realized something that chilled me to the bone. If I knew all this now, if I had reached this point, it meant that I had already been marked, and that, like it or not, there was no way back. My mind couldn't rest. The pieces were there, spread out before me like fragments of a puzzle that no one wanted to put together. The forbidden documents, the disappearance of Alfonso Grimaldi, the exorcisms that were never completed, the terrifying idea that some possessions weren't just attacks, but part of something bigger. I was facing a secret that the church itself was fighting to keep buried, but there was something I hadn't yet considered. Something that, deep down, made me feel a fear far deeper than any silent threat or whispered warning. What if this mystery was directly connected to what brought me here? I closed my eyes for a moment and went back to the beginning of it all. The possessed person I tried to help. The exorcism that shouldn't have failed, but did. The exact moment I realized this was no ordinary possession. The look of that person, who for a second didn't seem tormented by evil, but rather filled with ancient knowledge, something that studied me, analyzed me, as if he already knew exactly who I was. At the time, I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. I believed it was a trick, an illusion, part of demonic manipulation. But what if it wasn't? I opened one of the documents I had found and looked for patterns in the accounts of exorcisms that had never been revealed. And then I saw something that made me catch my breath. A specific description of an exorcism performed over 100 years ago. The priest who performed the ritual noted something unusual about the possessed person. For a moment, he didn't seem cursed. He didn't seem like a man in despair. He looked at me and smiled. And then he called me by my name before I had even introduced myself. My blood ran cold. I had gone through exactly the same experience. During the failed exorcism, that entity looked at me and said my name. He said it as if he already knew me, as if he knew what I would discover before I even started looking. I continued reading. The priest's report ended with a chilling warning. We're not just dealing with demons. We're dealing with something more intelligent, something older, something that watches, something that waits. My hands were shaking. I knew the church hid secrets, but until then I believed I was investigating something that only the Vatican tried to hide. Now I began to suspect that this secret ran much deeper than any human conspiracy. If there were entities that could be imprisoned in human bodies and that, from time to time, needed to be contained again, what did that mean? What if the person I tried to exorcise was never just possessed? What if she was already part of this hidden plan? What if the reason the exorcism failed was not demonic resistance, but rather because that presence within her shouldn't it be removed? Suddenly, everything made sense. The reports that described unsolved exorcisms, the priests who disappeared without explanation, the mysterious symbols that appeared on the bodies of the possessed, not as marks of evil, but as jealousy. It was as if these people were not just being attacked, but rather prepared for something. An even more terrifying idea began to form in my mind. The Vatican not only knew this, he could be involved. If some exorcisms were not failures, but rather part of a containment process, then the church was not just fighting evil, she was administering the evil. What if the person I tried to free should never be freed? What if that demon that seemed to know me wasn't an invader, but a guardian? A prisoner forced to remain inside that body for a reason I still couldn't understand. Everything I knew was being destroyed. my faith, my beliefs, my understanding of what was right and wrong. Evil can be fought, but what if, in some cases, it is necessary? What if the church has made a silent pact, not to eradicate evil, but to keep it under control? I needed to find out more. I needed to go back to the beginning, review everything I believed I knew about that exorcism, because now I was sure that case was never an exception. He was part of something much bigger. And if you've made it this far, if this story has gripped you, if you feel like this mystery needs to be revealed, I need you to share this video now. The more people who know about this, the stronger this investigation will become. So don't wait, share now, because what comes next could be even more disturbing. I felt like I was approaching something that should never have been discovered. The pieces were all there, fitting together in a way that defied everything I believed. The Vatican knew, the Church hid it, and now I began to understand why. The case of possession that I had faced was not an accident. It was not a simple demonic attack. He was part of a pattern, a cycle that had been repeating itself over the centuries. Some people were not possessed. They were chosen, marked to carry something that could not be released. My mind was spinning as I reread the secret files, trying to find more clues, something that could give me a definitive answer. But the truth was clear. There were names that disappeared from history, priests who got too close and were erased. Alfonso Grimaldi was one of them. He found something he shouldn't have, and so he was silenced. Now I was following the same steps. The question that never left my mind was inevitable. What if the same fate were in store for me? I closed my eyes and tried to think rationally. I could just stop, pretend I never found these documents, that I never made these connections. I could continue my life as a priest, accepting that there are mysteries that should not be questioned. But then I remembered what happened in that exorcism. From the look in that person's eyes, the way he observed me, as if he already knew everything before I even started my search. And most of all, the fact that the exorcism failed. This could not be ignored. It could not be left behind. Because if I was right, if these possessions really were part of something bigger, then what would happen when the next cycle began? How many other people would be tagged? How many priests would be silenced before someone finally exposed the truth? I took a deep breath. I needed to continue, even if it meant delving into territory I might never leave, even if it meant risking everything. Because now I knew the Church was not just fighting evil, she was negotiating with him. And that's why I need to ask, what would you do in my place? Would they continue investigating, knowing that the deeper I go, the greater the risk? Or would they stop before it was too late? Because what I've discovered so far is just the surface. There is still much more to be revealed. If you've made it this far, it means that this story has gripped you, that you felt the weight of this mystery, and that, like me, you want to know the truth. So now I need you to do some important things. First, subscribe to the channel. This ensures that you do not miss the continuation of this investigation, and that we can delve even deeper into this forbidden Vatican secret. If you watched until the end, leave your like now. This helps this video reach more people and prevents this story from being buried. And I want to know who really followed everything so far. So comment below. The truth needs to be revealed. I want to see how many people are with me on this journey and who truly believe there is something much bigger being hidden. And don't stop here. The next chapter of this investigation is now on screen. Click now and continue this story, because what comes next could change everything.